Thank you so much, and thank you to Ayanna Thompson and the entire RaceB4Race Executive Board for having me here today. And I want to send a special thanks as well to Leah Newsome and M. McDonough and Terry Kessler for helping me throughout this whole process and getting us here. And thank you to all of you for being here today with us. It's a real delight to be part of this event and to be part of such a culture. So, before beginning the talk itself, I do want to make a quick note that in 17th century South Asia, which is the prime context for this talk, the terms Afghan and Pashtun were often used interchangeably. It's important to keep in mind that today, in our present circumstances, Afghan does not refer to Pashtun communities exclusively, but for my talk here today, I will be using Afghan and Pashtun as synonyms in line as how they appear in premodern works. So, no further ado. Since we're here for poetics, let's begin with a little poetry. So, Da Afghan panangme wa tarallatura nangale de zamane khushal khatakyam. For Afghan dignity, I have taken up the blade. I am Khushal Khatak, the honorable man of the age. These lines are carved on a marble tombstone in the town of Akora Khatak in present-day Pakistan. Beneath that tombstone lies the corpse of the poet who composed them. The poet himself, Khushal Khatak, is mostly known for two things. One, being one of the most prolific authors of Pashto language verse in recorded history, and two, for taking part in a rebellion of rural Pashtun communities in 1672 against the Mughal Empire. In light of this biographical sketch, it almost makes too much sense that Khushal is today made out to be the quote-unquote founder of Pashto literature. The lyrics above his grave that we just read become a patriotic expression of, quote, national feelings which determine most distinctive features of mentality and societal ideology of the Pashtun people, end quote. It does make too much sense. Reading Khushal's verses as a proto-nationalist war cry is part of our far vaster tradition of deploying contemporary ideas of ethnicity into the Afghan past. From conference halls to media newsrooms to military briefings, contemporary British, Soviet, and American depictions of Afghans portray a people who are locked out of historical time and eternally bound to primordial honor codes. Consider comments on the suffering of Afghan women made very recently by Cheryl Bernard. So, the practices that are worst for women stem from the so-called Pashtun Code, a strongly patriarchal, hierarchical system which held that male prestige required the total submission and absolute virtue of their women. Seclusion, veiling, and illiteracy to prevent any opportunity for misconduct, and honor killings to remove the stain of even rumored or perceived female wrongdoing are its ugliest accompaniments. Afghan women vastly prefer Sharia law to Pashtun Wale, the Pashtun honor code. Any outside help now can best come from other, more advanced Muslim societies and their religious scholars. So, in this evaluation, the root cause of social harm is actually, it's not Islam, the way that it often gets coded over the last couple of years, right? It's actually just being Pashtun, or a commitment to being Pashtun. So that Pashtun sense of being, or Pashtun Wale, is something that must be transcended, perhaps through the Islam of more advanced, non-Pashtun Muslims, if violence, and in particular women's suffering, is to be stopped. In other words, being Pashtun is a problem that must be solved. In the words of Sahar Ghamkhor and Alila Dawlatzai, prevailing theories of the Taliban are not only racializing in the ways that they present the group as a violent pathology, but also as belonging to a rural insurgency, always returning the Talib to a rural conservative Pashtun of the South, an unruly, backward figure who prevents the nation's progress. Now, with such a framework in mind, it's all too easy to read Khushal Khatak's lyrics from the 17th century as giving voice to the pre-existent, eternal reality of honor-bound Pashtun communal sentiment. It's all too easy to imagine the poet astride his horse Sileh, swift as the wind for which she was named, gathering a host of rural Pashtun tribesmen and calling to them as they charge the decidedly foreign armies of the Mughal Empire. And then it's all too easy to use that image and that conflict from the 17th century as a near prophetic foreshadowing of more recent Afghan resistance to British, Soviet, and American imperial adventures. It's all too easy for today's struggles, in other words, to ring to us as clear echoes of past wars, past failures of governance, quote unquote. After all, as Joe Biden so recently proclaimed in 2021, no nation has ever unified Afghanistan. No nation. Empires have gone there and not done it. I wonder whether he was talking about his own. Now, what I want to do for the rest of this talk is to try and escape this framework and this dialectics. And there are many ways in which one can do so, and I'd point here to numerous excellent critiques in recent times of our overly ethnicized readings of Pashto literature and Afghan history. For example, the work of William Sherman on apocalypse, genealogy, and religious poetry. My aim here is to complement such projects by interrogating the ways in which a poet of supposed national feelings like Khoshal Khattak uses the terms Afghan and Pashtun. So here's the thesis. Far from operating with a stable notion of Pashtun, Khoshal's verses evince a deep anxiety about the category. Much of that anxiety is actually generated by the presence of royal or governmental power, in this case the Mughal Empire. In other words, the presence of the Mughal, conceptually, has a powerful destabilizing effect upon the idea or concept of Pashtun, necessitating a form of corrective intervention. And for Khoshal, that intervention is poetic composition itself, which generates the new and necessary Pashtun subjectivity. I'm arguing here that if we want to understand the lyrics of Khoshal Khattak, we must break it off from our sense of Afghan ahistoricity, embedding it within its socio-temporal context as a highly contingent manifestation of what being Pashtun or Pashtun Wale meant. By doing so, we're better poised to uproot Khoshal's verses from where they have been planted, as the source from which an unchanging quote-unquote mentality and societal ideology of Pashtun people has flowed into our present. So, to set the stage, I should say a few words about Khoshal Khattak himself. Khoshal was born in 1613 into a family of landowners in the Khyber region. Like his grandfather and father before him, he spent much of his life in military service to the Mughal Empire, suppressing rebellions, often the rebellions of Pashtun tribesmen, along the critical trade route of the Grand Trunk Road. In 1658, the reigning Mughal emperor named Aurangzeb imprisoned Khoshal for 10 years, stripping him of all status and holdings. And when Khoshal was released, he took to the countryside and began fomenting rebellion against his former patrons. And in 1672, he at last went to battle against the Mughals. During this latter part of his life, he also began a strident literacy campaign among his fellow tribesmen. Several members of his family, including a wife and a daughter, would later on have poetic careers themselves. Now, I should also take time here to introduce the other key players in the story, the Mughals themselves. And when I say the term Mughal here, I'm referring specifically to the Mughal dynasty, right? Sovereigns who ruled much of India and South Asia between 1526 and 1858, Gregorian calendar. More generally, however, Mughal is one of those common premodern terms in South and Central Asia which we use for the idea of Mongol. When used in the context of the Mughal dynasty in South Asia, the word recalled Mughal emperors' genealogical descent from such world-conquering Mongol sovereigns such as Taimur or Tamerlane and Genghis Khan or Genghis Khan. This lineage would become a critical feature of Mughal emperors' performance of sovereignty and even find echoes in anti-colonial vernacular poetry of the early 20th century, decades after the Mughals' eventual dethronement by the British in 1858. So for centuries before the British, Soviet, and American conquests, the Mughals were subjugating, patronizing, slaughtering, trading with, and otherwise engaging Pashtun communities. And as can be seen from his biography, Khoshal Khattak's own life evinces that shifting spectrum of possibilities. Following his release from imprisonment in 1668, Khoshal composed an abundance of verses, many of which work through that struggling Mughal-Pashtun relationship. His concern stems from not only the gaping power differential between the two parties, but the transformative effect of proximity to the Mughals themselves. So here we have some verses. I'm all about the dignity of Pashtuns, but they're the Mughals' catch of the day. Like dogs, they come and go over and again for the Mughals' broth and bread. Or as Khoshal states elsewhere, those who slurp up Mughal super dogs. What do I even call such dogs as these? The Mughals here appear as patrons and providers, offering daily bread. By accepting that offer, Pashtuns can no longer relate to them as equals or even human beings. Rather, they take on the relationship of domesticated dogs to human masters, creatures reliant upon those human masters for nourishment, who are then subject to the latter's commands. Such a positionality is cast in opposition to the attainment and maintenance of human dignity, or nang. Servitude is not, however, the ultimate social harm made possible by the Mughals' proximity. The Mughals engage the Pashtuns as servants, but that only functions as something of a gateway that enables a greater misfortune, losing one's own subjectivity and taking on that of a Mughal personhood. We see this play out in verses detailing Khoshal's eventual betrayal by his own uncles during a royal summons. So I went straight there to the court, thinking myself innocent, but my uncles, no family of mine, became Mughals in their evil. Dogs though Pashtun servitors may be for Khoshal, but they at least retain some semblance of their own selfhoods. Something different and more dangerous has happened to Khoshal's uncles. The threat brought by the Mughals runs deeper than forcing a people into an undignified position. One's very self-definition might change based on unethical actions taken in service to the Mughal kings. To become Mughal or Mughal Shawal suggests the permeability of the category, and that's defined not only by positionality of power, but by behavioral standards as well. How does Khoshal know about any of this, right? The answer lies in his own proximity to the Mughals, not just personally, but generationally. So as he states, "My life has gone by in right and true conduct. Never had I done anything to cheat the Mughals. My forefathers gave up their ghosts in leal duty. Never was there a Pashtun so resolute as I." Khoshal spent his formative years eating off the Mughal table. Yet crucially, unlike those Pashtuns he reviles as dogs, he eats not just the table scraps of the Mughal emperors, which will eject a person from their humanity and into an essential subservience, but he takes salt, namak, in the same way that his father and his grandfather are said to have taken salt. So here we have his repeat invocation of salt, though I was brought up on Mughal salt. Eating salt binds Khoshal and his family to the Mughals as protected persons existing within a patron-client relationship of mutual claims. And for his part in this relationship, Khoshal offered his service as a soldier on military campaigns, many of which involved suppressing rebellions amongst other tribes of Pashtuns, such as the Yusufzais. So as he himself notes, "I was a killing poison in the Yusufzais' lives. I had no other ambition in serving the Mughals." Through taking Mughal salt, Khoshal has turned himself into a fatal food for the Yusufzais. And in fact, the entire landscape which he's mapping out here can actually be understood according to an economy of consumption. Let's remember the Pashtun tribesmen are the catch or niwal of the Mughals, out on a royal hunt. By eating the broth and bread of the Mughals, the ash o nan, the tribesmen are reduced to dogs, which can then be sent out to continue hunting further for their Mughal masters. Relationships that are formed through salt or namak are tinged with a measure of pride for rural elites like Khoshal's family, who benefit from them. Now those ones who are nourished by salt will turn into poison, zahr, for those deemed by the Mughals to be not worth catching, the irredeemable enemies of empire, who can simply be extirpated. Now the smooth functioning of this economy of consumption is interrupted by a single event, Khoshal's own imprisonment. In the poet's own eyes, it's his refusal to fully participate in the Mughals' consumptive economy that generates the disruption. When speaking of the reasons for his imprisonment, he says, "One was my arrogance in service and right conduct. The other, that I didn't pay off Mughal greed with the ordinary bribes." The scaffolding that supports such specific problems for Khoshal is a more generalized racial hatred. The Mughal has a dark heart toward Pashtuns. And crucially, that conflict is regarded as an absolute and an existential one. There's no end to be seen in the war between but this. Either the Mughals get lost or the Pashtuns are ruined. Pashtuns who think elsewise should get wise. There's no salvation save by the sword, just no other way. Pashtuns are better swordsmen than Mughals, If only Pashtuns would wise up and get some sense. I'm the only one worrying about dignity and repute. There go the laid-back Yusufzays, tilling and sowing. So here, Khushal seems to be participating in what was, by his own day, an established discourse in theorizing what it meant to be Afghan or Pashtun, emphasizing an essential discord. Being Afghan or Pashtun here ultimately means being unable to undertake collective action because you're being driven by self-centered concerns. It's necessary to fight together for long-term benefit, but as Khushal bemoans, Pashtuns will turn from war in order to satisfy more imminent short-term needs. At a glance, verses like these seem to reinforce the long-standing ways of speaking about Afghans and Pashtuns that I critiqued at the beginning of the talk. Pashtuns are at once unified in opposition to foreign forces and completely incapable of being brought together in any lasting form. But such a reading only stands if we take Khushal's words as a reflection of reality and not as a carefully crafted rhetorical setup for his main point. They say it's good to give to children from the soul. May God make the current run through the source waters. All the words that I've brought out with my mouth, let them all be etched upon the heart. So the critical ingredient here in generating the desired Pashtun communal selfhood, one that will rescue the tribes from ruination and defeat the Mughal scourge, is actually poetry itself. Poetic speech emerges from the poet's spirit, or zan. It takes shape within his mouth, as khola, and it lands on the listener's heart, or zra. Khushal here links the process to the machinations of God in worldly time. Poetry is guided through the source waters by divine forces, thus unleashing its true potential. Poetry does not express, in other words, the pre-existing ideal Pashtun self. It creates it. But it cannot do so without the existence of the Mughal. Khushal's starkest declarations of what it means to be a Pashtun or Afghan, both for himself and for others, come not within some ahistorical vacuum, but through a very specific dialectic encounter with the Mughals themselves. So, like a falcon, I eye my grand prey. I'm no dust-grubbing eater of dung beetles. I'm a lion eating meat for a living. I'm no mouse nibbling on the grass. When I ate as a Mughal man of rank, I was a king. Now I'm no longer a Mughal officer. I'm an angel. There's no more command, no permissions. Thank the Lord, the only command is my own. I've nothing to do with the court, with the rabble and the elite. I think nothing of the throne or the accounting book. Rugs and blankets will suffice for Pashtuns. I think nothing of cushions and mattresses. I'm free in my white rough-spun robes. Enough with worrying over gold-woven clothes. A humble house made of grass would be better than sitting in some stone-built quarters. So Khushal's rustic Pashtun in these verses comes into focus as a figure who's radically separated from governance, split not only from the administrative court, the diwan, but also society in general, the khas o am. The Mughal world is built of stone. It's replete with fine clothes, luxurious house settings, and managed through royal commands and tax registers. One might be a petty king or malek in such a world. But Khushal reveals the true nature of even such kings, once again through sustenance. They eat fodder and dung beetles. Better, the poet claims, to be an ascetic hunter of celestial nature, freed from the anxieties of pursuing rank under the Mughal Empire. Pashtuns appear here as a sort of dervish collective, purposefully embracing poverty as a superior form of being in the world. If we sever Khushal's verses from this imminent political context, we might read them as, again, portraits of historical truth. Pashtuns appear to be rustic borderland folk, stubbornly resisting all efforts at bringing them under political control. Khushal's poetry seemingly celebrates an innate Pashtun simple-mindedness and independent spirit. Yet reading more broadly, it is so clear that none of this is the case. For Khushal, Pashtuns are also slinking dogs in the Mughal courtyard. They are loyal followers, bound in patron-client relationships through the sacrality of something like salt. They are a powerful but ultimately self-interested collective that has no capacity for long-term goals. They are even capable of turning into Mughals themselves. Khushal's own career embodies the teetering set of possible relationships made possible by the presence of Mughal power. And it's precisely the evident diversity of Pashtun socio-political life that Khushal regards as a problem that needs to be solved. If Pashtuns remain locked within the wider social world of the Mughal Empire, he seems to say, they'll invariably splinter and change under the denaturing influence of their Mughal patrons. The only solution is for Afghans to avowedly eschew all markers of Mughal life. Through such a radical commitment, it might just become possible to break free of the Mughals' gravitational pull. And the strength of Khushal's lyrical odes is based on this precisely being not the case in his present. So ultimately for Khushal, the Pashtun emerges as a very fragile concept. It's deeply sensitive to the churning political forces brought into the world by the weight of Mughal sovereignty. The historical reality of Pashtuns is an obvious set of unpalatable truths, proffering undignified servitude as the norm, hinting at darker consequences to come. Far from devaluing Khushal's poetry, this context actually heightens the stakes of it. Both those stakes and Khushal's anxieties come into view when he embeds his circumstances within the broader warp and weft of cosmic time. Everywhere Dajjal's army crowds the land, there's no Mahdi to match him by his own beauty. It's the end times, hashed up with corruption everywhere. It's all against all, the whole world over, house against house. So the Dajjal, in most Islamic discourses of the time, is commonly held to be a pretender messiah who shows up at the end of time. And he's a figure who can only be opposed by the Mahdi, or the actual Messiah. In most tellings of this future history, the Mahdi ultimately wins out over his nemesis, ushering in an age of justice prior to the last day. Yet Khushal's evaluation of his times is tinged with despair. His epoch is an apocalypse, bereft of the beauty of messianic salvation. The world is enmeshed in tangled webs of corruption or fasad, which annihilate any and all bonds of solidarity, including communal and familial ones. Perhaps there's hope yet in resistance through radical social disavowal, as the poet elsewhere suggests. But even if so, there's much work that must be done if one means to escape the long shadow of the Mughals, and at least in Khushal's eyes, seems that the people around him not there yet. So, my aim throughout this talk has been to illuminate the conceptual power of Mughal in Khushal's poetry. And in doing so, I hope I've demonstrated not only how the Mughal pressured notions of being Pashtun, but how being Pashtun itself could be an immensely fraught condition for somebody like Khushal. I want to leave you with some sense for how precarious the Afghan position might have been, largely in response to our contemporary habits of emphasizing solid, strong, timeless Pashtun tradition as an authoritative explanation for social harm. My concern with doing so is because of my own positionality within Anglophone academia, which has played no small part in reinforcing operative notions of eternal Afghan barbarism throughout these past decades of murder, occupation, and the present economic strangulation of Afghanistan by the United States and much of the civilized Western world. But let us close by leaving that tradition aside for a moment, just for a moment, and turning towards a different reception of Khushal Khattak's poetry. So here is a couple of pages from a 1992 text published in Kabul called Khushal's 100 Useful Counsels, put together by one Dr. Arif Osman. The text is divided into its titular counsels, which are excerpts from Khushal Khattak's works. Each of Khushal's Pashto verses in the form of counsels is accompanied by a translation in Baloch, in Persian, Turkmen, Uzbek, languages which are widely spoken across today's Afghanistan as well as the surrounding regions. And Khushal himself is introduced in the text as both the sage of the Afghan nation and the physician of Afghanistan's ills. The project of something like Khushal's 100 Useful Counsels cannot be reconciled with our common evaluations of Khushal as the, quote, recognized founder of Pashto national literature, unquote, whose verses express Pashtun, quote, patriotic motives with a tribal touch, end quote. When we restrict our reading of Khushal to the effort to unlock the, quote, historical roots of the Pashtun's national consciousness, end quote, we remain unable to understand why a septilingual text like this would be published in 20th century Kabul, memorializing a poet buried across the border in Akora Khattak as the physician of Afghanistan's ills. Yet Khoshal's 100 Useful Counsels and many other such projects have always been circulating and continue to do so to this day, evading the logics by which empire's observers seek to trap history and lyric alike, much as Khoshal himself sought to escape both the tangible and epistemic fetters of his own imperial foe. It's on us right now to take a cue from such pasts and to follow suit. Thank you. So to lead into the discussion, I actually wanted to kind of use this last slide, which I know might not necessarily seem legible at the moment, but one of the things that I was reading with while coming to this presentation was a book, Mizamura's Fall of Language in the Age of English, which is about that tension between having a universal language which actually allows for the sort of solidarity that we're expressing here today, that people have been expressing for such a long time, but then the effect that that might have on the brilliance, intensity, and development of local languages. Because this presentation is actually only possible for me right now because these verses are things that I've translated into English for you, right? And we can talk about them in English. So I really wanted to leave off with a question more generally, beyond the specific context of Pashto poetics or Khoshal himself, on when our projects rely upon such acts of translation specifically in order to broaden our methodological and epistemic frontiers, right? How do we manage to somehow bring into play that tension, that dialectic between the fact that we have tools within a universal language, a way of talking about things in English right now, and then the struggle to bring out something of a very quote-unquote alien mentality, right? Like a very different way of understanding something like poetics, a different structure of prosody, all those things which actually illuminate the work for something like Khoshal, or the work in uncountable other contexts that we all kind of work in today. So I just wanted to have a bit of a conversation with you guys, or at least to start the conversation about that tension and to see what kind of ideas come out through there. Thank you.
That was fascinating. Thank you so much. So I have a couple of questions about his audience and who he's writing for. Since the conference about poetics, is he writing within poetic? Sorry. Better? Okay. Yeah. To what extent is he writing within pre-existing poetic traditions, and especially that of Persian? And what is the literacy rate within the society that he's writing? Is he aiming these poems at the court? And what do you think he is expecting to get out of writing this poetry? Thank you.
Thank you. So that's actually something that he addresses himself in a lot of his poetry, right? Like for your first question, like there's a history of Pashto literature before Khoshal, but Khoshal claims to be, and he acknowledges that himself in his own poetry, but he'll also claim that I'm the first one to actually write Pashto, right? So when he thinks about the books of Akhund Darweza, for example, a theologian, he'll say, this has been written, I acknowledge it, there's no value in this whatsoever, like I am actually the first one to do what has been done in Persian and all these other, like this broad sort of cosmopolitan, glossy language that we like kind of amp up these days as the Persianate cosmopolis or whatever. And he says, well, I'm the first one to actually do something like this in Pashto. But precisely because there is a history of Pashto language before this, right? We even find it in scraps and bits. It's a very fragmentary archive. But from the 16th century, for example, we have numerous examples of multilingual contexts for Pashto. For example, there's a Sufi master in North India who we have scraps of his trilingual devotional poetry to God in Pashto, Persian, and Hindawi, right? And that's preceding somebody like Khoshal for a century. So there is some murky context there which we do not have full access to. But I think what he is saying that he's doing is there's a unique project here, and it means something different to him to write in Pashto. And I don't think that that's about writing in a vernacular language so that a specific ethnic group can understand it, right? Because there are a lot of people who were writing in Pashto who were just not Pashtuns, right? There's something about Pashto as a language which he's trying to bring out in the poetic form, which is recognizable. I mean, Khushal himself writes in Persian, like the sort of court language in other contexts, but he's trying to say that there is something more in the project of writing Pashto verse than there is to writing in Persian. And as to the audience for exactly that sort of questions, I think here we have a relatively rare example where it's not necessarily relegated to the court atmosphere, right? Like this has no reception at any court at its time whatsoever. And he is somebody who, there's been research done on how he is somebody who wanted to make sure that specifically his own community was literate, all right? Produced books, produced text. And that is something that he was invested in doing, so he had resources somehow. And in some ways, I was having a conversation earlier about how somebody like Khushal, we can understand him as sort of one of those like dispossessed white Russians, like off in poverty at the end of his life, but still with those connections and that way of imperial being that allows him to generate this volume of work. Because my printed edition of his collected works runs to over 1,000 pages, right? And so he did a lot. And I think that it was geared towards his community.
Hi, can you hear me? This was incredible. Thank you so much. I'm freaking out. I wanted to ask you maybe like a boring technical question that would allow you to brag about how you get to something like this, like what's in front of us. You know, I study Arabic, and I'm always struck at how to get to Arabic as an English speaker in a Western university. I have to encounter 19th century German Orientalism, whether I like it or not. I never intended to study any of that, but I now have to show up and I have to sit with them because they wrote the first textbooks, right? And so I'm wondering, given all of that, which any of us who've ever dipped our toe into anything non-Western, we're too familiar, what is the sort of history of studying Pashto from the West? What resources do you have? Do you have a dictionary that you could even give in a sort of imaginary undergrad Pashto class? Do you have a catalog that you can rely on? Like, what's your archive? A little bit about what's online, just something about the sort of technical labor, the sort of unsexy part that goes into making something this far away possible for us, yeah.
Thank you so much, and that's very kind of you, and it's a really excellent question. And I completely sympathize at the beginning with all of the problems that you were talking about, right? Like, my personal kind of journeys with these languages is calibrated a little bit differently, just because of my own personal background. But I have a lot of sympathy when I see other folks like coming into it, right? Because all of that excitement and verve that you get of wanting to do this is just immediately swept off by like these. I don't know what's worse, like the colonial era grammars or like this uber nationalist text that's like you must know every military term before like learning how to quote one line of poetry in something like Arabic, right? Like and your question actually really goes to show the fact that the study of these languages in the West has by and large been defined by occupation, by military endeavor, by murder on a massive scale, and the attempt to facilitate that sort of thing. So there's in my limited experience with the actual pedagogy of it, it feels rather difficult. Like and having that sort of consciousness that you're bringing to the fore right now is the only way in which I think you can survive having to deal with these sources. Because even if I'm going to recommend anything for like Pashto, for example, they run through the most regressive possible mediums, right? And again, my experience of the language is a little bit different just because of the social aspect of it, and so I don't really have I've never sat in a class for Pashto. But what I can tell you for English is that a lot of the easily available grammars and stuff like that you would find are things rooted in they were actually published in like the turn of the 20th century in the city of Peshawar in British India, where you have these officers who are trying to come up with grammars and dictionaries in order to basically facilitate direct communication with tribesmen who were initially held after the year 1857 to be the bulwark of British power. Because prior to the year 1857 in South Asia, the communication between Pashto-speaking communities and colonial power had predominantly been undertaken by local Hindu communities and also diasporic Afghans in North India. And after 1857, which is the context, there was a big rebellion in 1857 against the British East India Company in South Asia. But after that rebellion, British officials basically decided that all of these Pashto speakers who had immigrated, they were not trustworthy, they were mutinous. And so you actually see prefaces in the grammars and dictionaries from Peshawar talking about how these people are untrustworthy, they're an inferior race, real Afghans will look down upon diasporic Afghans, and that's sort of very intentional race making through language. And the idea of bringing English and Pashto into conversation was something that was done in order to cut out those sorts of communities who had traditionally been looping back and forth for centuries, right? The first histories of Afghans are written by like 5th generation diasporic individuals in India. It's a very old connection, but everything from British border making to dictionaries has been an effort to try to cut that off. There's a saying in Pashto, La robar yo Afghan de, that highland or lowland, there's only one Afghan. And you still see those logics in communities today that are organizing to just ignore that kind of violent history, right? It's a very long and unsexy answer to your question, so I apologize for the length of it, but those old grammars and dictionaries are still a good starting point. The best thing you can do, find somebody who speaks Pashto, talk to your Afghan friends, talk to your Pashtun friends, and just sit down, play some chess. You'll learn a lot from that, I think. I think up in there in the front row.
Thank you very much. I loved the talk, and it made me think of many things I didn't expect to think of. So one of those things is the priority of writing and versus orality. And I, coming from study of an oral culture, a Haudenosaunee culture, I think that there's often been a resistance to writing itself as an assimilatory tool. And so it's not something like we've got to get this written down to save it. It's like, no, you have to learn it to save it. And so the notion is, and I was wondering about this when I saw even the title of this conference is Poetics. Certainly we could have a Ginyangiha or Mohawk poem, but to say a poetics, I don't even know where that is with the hierarchy. Do we have a poetics of an oral language? Do you have to have writing to have a poetics, is I guess my question. And just in the way that our culture resists referring to our spiritual practice as religion. It's a word we tend to reject even when they say, oh, the Longhouse religion. No, thank you. It has a feeling of uplift to us that we don't want. And so I was wondering where that, like I see a lot of tension in some of the things you described as around what I would call assimilation, right? Becoming the other through their practices. And there has always been this deep suspicion around writing and language acquisition in my own community. And so I know they're far afield, but I'm just interested if there is this tension with writing itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are both really excellent points. And to go to your first one about what happens with poetics in our oral language, I think here you see a sort of tension between the fact that the development of like formal prosody, which structures very heavily all of the poems that you see over here, is something that emerges from the precise imperial context that is being fought against, right? And I think part of my reading of somebody like Khushal, who is circulated orally and whose poetry is still something that to this day, like you'll hear it song fragments, right? Like people will still actually perform the poetry in different ways than reading it. It's not the predominant mode of relating to this sort of material. Part of what I think he's doing here is actually showing at least his mentality of the fact that there is a way to divorce the specific sciences and the intricacies that are possible through the prosody that he himself has embodied, by dwelling in the imperial circle for the first 60 years of his life, really, right? Like he calls himself, I'm Whitebeard, by the time that he starts a rebellion. So I think for him, he wants that to be separated out. He wants that so that he can rescue his own particular ode, and also because he's a self-interested guy. He wants to be the founder of Pashto poetry in some ways, and he produces this sort of volume of text in order to make a claim that this is what Pashto poetry actually looks like. All of that being said, the orality question that you brought up for something like Pashto is incredibly significant because enunciation is one of the most unstable things here in this language, right? Even the name of the language itself, I say Pashto because I'm speaking to you in English, but depending on where you are, it's Pakhto. It's not Pashto. There's a letter in the language itself, in the name of the language itself, which is entirely unstable, right? In his context, you could say Pashto, Pakhto, or Afghani, and it would all mean the exact same sort of thing. There are verbs here in the poetry that we've seen today, which are specific to not only a particular locality, but his own tribe, right? There are pronunciations for common words like Azmare is lion, but he'll say Mazre, and that's something that is still preserved within the fact that his lyric reads like this. But he only preserves that lyric by making the sounds themselves adhere to the specific science of prosody, which is dominated by like Imperial Persian in that context, right? So it's a little bit of a convoluted answer, and I think here you actually don't see like a strong resistance. You see an attempt to rescue empire, and maybe a sort of assimilation in that in and of itself. And that I think also kind of goes to your second question about that tension with assimilation. Like, yes, I think he's really concerned about the imminent socio-political facts of being around the Mongols, but culturally speaking, I'm not so certain that this is the case for him, because. And I hesitate to speculate upon motives or anything like that, but at least in terms of performance, the way that he can perform a sophisticated sense of Pashto poetry is within conversation, is within that dialectic, with the thing which he has kind of known and promulgated his entire life. So in that way, actually, the Mughal continues to bear down on what it means to produce in Pashto during the time of Khushal. Hope that answered the question.
So that actually takes us right up to time, but the great thing is the conversation doesn't have to stop. So first off, can we get a huge round of applause for Tanvir Ahmed?